welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our continued conversation on the intersection of technology and democracy. This is the third webinar in the series of conversations brought to you by Voatz and Eclypses. A couple of housekeeping notes before we start. There will be a few minutes for Q&A at the end of the discussion. Please send us your questions via the chat box. The speakers will try to answer the questions as much as possible, time permitting, of course. Please keep your questions specific to the expertise of the panelists. We will be recording this webinar and it will be available on view on the Voatz YouTube channel. We will post it to Twitter as well. Now over to our moderator, technology writer Sarah Cobble. You may have read her work in InfoSecurity Magazine and Secure Academy. She has also hosted previous channels for us. Thank you so much for joining us, and over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Lavanya. So today we introduce you to the companies and the technology leaders who keep some of our most high-stakes applications secure. It takes the collaboration of several companies to ensure that our everyday apps like banking and healthcare and the apps of the future like voting are safe for us to use with confidence. With new and emerging threats on the rise, it is now more important than ever to safeguard your mobile applications against targeted mobile attacks that happen at the application level. This panel will discuss the optimal approach to staying ahead of cyber hackers and ransomware attacks, and seek to answer the question, is our fear of attacks and our response to them equal to the threats that exist? Now, let's meet our panel. Baljeet Malhotra is the founder and CEO of TeejLab Inc., a cybersecurity company focused on API risk management at a global scale. Before starting TeejLab, he established the R&D unit of Black Duck Software in 2016. Previously, he was research director at SAP, computational scientist at the EOS lab, and software engineer at Satyam Computers. Baljeet received a PhD in computing science from the University of Alberta. He was awarded NSERC Scholar in 2005 and Global Young Scientist in 2011. He concurrently holds adjunct professor positions at the University of British Columbia, the University of Victoria, and the University of Northern BC. Nimit Sawhney is co-founder and CEO of Voatz Inc., an elections platform that uses identity proofing, biometrics, and blockchain technology to enable end-to-end verifiable and accessible remote voting via smartphones and tablets. Voatz has run more than 82 elections in partnership with both major political parties at the state level, as well as with state/county governments, towns, cities, universities, professional organizations, including the country's first mobile voting project with West Virginia in 2018. Nimit's background is in mobile security and software development. He previously served as Director of R&D at Obertha Technologies, and prior to that, as Director of R&D at More Magic Solutions. And our third panelist for today is Bryan, the CEO of Eclypses, a company that developed an innovative and disruptive data security solution technology for all mobile applications, websites, and IoT devices called MTE technology. MTE is unique as it secures data at the application level, provides endpoint verification, jailbreak or root protection, and zero trust with full knowledge. Under Bryan's leadership, Eclypses has released MTE 2.0, which includes FIPS 143 validation, and is now operational in mobile, website, and IoT devices throughout financial services, healthcare, critical infrastructure, and retail industries. Bryan has led many successful exits at both the board and executive level. A couple of notable examples are Congruity and Easy Castle Integration. So let's start with the questions. All of us are familiar with apps. We've probably downloaded and used hundreds of them. Nimit, can you tell us how the approach to cybersecurity differs between a low-stakes app, for example, a simple puzzle game, and a high-stakes app like one that enables electronic voting?
So in terms of what we call as a run-of-the-mill app, like the one you described, like a game or a news reading app, for example, the sensitivity of the data that's being transmitted and accessed is very different. For example, to play a game or to read a news app, you necessarily don't have to prove your identity to the highest, strictest level of assurance. Similarly, you don't need the level of privacy or the level of encryption to secure the data that's passing through. Compare that to a very high stakes scenario such as a sensitive financial transaction or a electronic voting transaction. The security model there is very, very different. Here you have several things to keep in mind: how to ensure the privacy and the anonymity of the user, at the same time being able to authenticate them to ensure that they're actually eligible, then ensuring that data is encrypted, cannot be tampered with, cannot be viewed or you know done any kind of nefarious action en route. So it's depending on the use case, depending on the scenario, there's different levels of threats involved and different levels of mitigations and resources. And so those are things you need to keep in mind as you are evaluating a threat model for a specific app.
Okay, so it's really use-led is what I'm hearing, a model. Okay, thank you. So application security starts in the development phase with testing used to detect flaws. Baljeet, how do you think companies should approach their mobile app security strategy?
So to answer your question, I think security starts with design. Even before your app is designed, as Nimit pointed out, understanding the producers and consumer sides of things. Who's going to consume the data, who's going to produce the data, there are third parties involved in the supply chain. So all those factors need to be accounted as part of your design process. And then, of course, there are different dimensions to data. Apart from privacy, personal information, you could have certain other aspects of data as well. So data modeling is fundamental to application security. And then, of course, you have operational aspect of the security. So when you put all those pieces together, very much from the design phase itself, you really need to model different dimensions of threat. And of course, the technology stack, what's the maturity level you need from an encryption perspective, and how data is being transacted, and and also the consumer side. Is it an app that is socially going to be used? For example, voting app. It is I call it a consumer app. It is not like a bank app where you have a limited set of customers trying to access different products and services. A voting system could be much more sensitive to different threats. So application security starts all the way from design, considering all the different dimensions to data and the consumers and producers, and all the way to operational aspect. So I would say there is no one answer, but again, you have a complete stack when it comes to application security.
Would you say that app security is a bit too reliant on manual configuration?
I would say security is also a data management problem. And a lot of time, these configurations could be automated and more intelligent. But of course, you cannot completely automate and make security intelligent. I mean, in security, it's always, you manage risks. You can never make the threat to be zero, although there is a zero trust model, but you're always working to minimize the risk. And although there are ways you can do manual configurations or try to automate as much possible, but once again, there are manual configurations and interventions always needed as part of your security posture.
Interesting. Okay, I've got a question now for Bryan. Your company is on the cybersecurity scary front line. What new threats are you seeing in the mobile application landscape with the growing 5G network?
What we see in the 5G landscape, and something that Baljeet and Nimit both talked about, was that people have to start thinking about things in the security first mindset. They have to ask themselves, what data could possibly be compromised and what could possibly be done with that mobile application? Not only from a security perspective with personal information, but what would happen reputationally if that data was accessed? And the reason that I mention that is when we start looking at the 5G landscape and the 5G landscape in general, what we see is a lot of projected adoption of what was traditionally a telecom network being adopted and being used for a lot of things that weren't traditionally on those networks. And we have to start thinking of things in a very, secure way, in the way that we think about traditional networks, where, a lot of times what we see is the mobile apps were the add-on or the afterthought, or, things from the cell phone were almost not looked at with the same level of security that you wanted to look at the rest of your network. So 5G is introducing a lot more usage, and I think people have to start thinking about it in a much different way and start treating their mobile app like they would anything else that's facing out or getting customer access on their network, with the level of security first, then designing into function, but making sure they're providing that security function that they really needed to start with.
So are there new threats per se, or just the same things but a different flavor?
I think a lot of them are going to be the same threats that we've experienced, but we're going to experience them on the 5G side of the world, where traditionally, you would take an IoT device, you drop it out somewhere, maybe you put a wired network or you put a wireless network near it and secured it that way. When you start looking at 5G, you're going to start seeing some of those IoT devices going directly to the 5G networks. And you start seeing a lot more adoption, and you're going to see a lot more usage of the 5G, because as we look at Starlink and we start looking at some of the different technologies out there, we're going to see 5G be primary wireless communication for a lot of people. And that's just not something that's been done in the past for people. So you're all of a sudden going to take that network, and it's no longer that little telecom network that's just running your mobile app or your mobile devices. It's now a network that's running a lot more communications, or has a possibility of running a lot more. Every time we hear a new discussion about 5G, we hear different proposed adoptions, I would say. And I think that's where we're going to see a little bit of a change. So it's not that all of a sudden the hackers are going to get smarter. It's they're going to say, hey, what haven't they fixed? As Baljeet said, you have to worry about the security posture of your devices and of your applications, because if you haven't gone out and secured your APIs, or you haven't secured the way your data was transferred before you did this, this is going to become a very frontline issue for you in terms of your security landscape as that adoption drives even more and more.
Absolutely.
Just to add, sorry to interrupt you, Sarah, just to add to what Bryan said, I think one of the fundamental game changers with 5G is we're going to have a lot more what's called as traffic route points, just because of the more distributed nature of the network. And as Bryan mentioned, that increases the number of threat points where adversaries can get into the network. And the other thing to keep in mind is, because it's going to be so much faster than the existing 4G networks, there's a big chance that our existing security monitoring is going to get the bandwidth around it's going to get severely strained, because now suddenly where you could control or the throughput of the attacks which are hitting the system, that's going to be like now 50, 100 times more. So all that also will need to be scaled up as we push more devices on 5G.
So could that slow down attack response times potentially?
Initially, yes, because it's fair to assume that not all the security monitoring around the world is going to scale as fast as some of these networks are getting deployed. And so definitely there's going to be a what's called a short-term pain, where people scale up, add more infrastructure on that side. So I think that would be a fair assumption.
If I could just add something to that comment, because Nimit, you brought up an excellent point there. One thing that Baljeet talked about was the automation of monitoring and automation of watching things. Those are based on past performance and past metrics and, looking at the heuristics of what was going on. When we start looking at the change to 5G, we're going to see a change in that, and AI and all of the other learning tools are going to take a little bit of time to get to the point where they're able to effectively and efficiently provide some of the data. So as Baljeet said, we're going to need to have a level of personal interaction with this, and we're going to need to think about security on those mobile applications to not just say, we're monitoring it, it's not that big of an attack threat point. We're going to introduce a lot of threat points, we're going to introduce a lot of attack surfaces, and we need to be able to go at them with security and with a real plan of how to address them, not only now, but in the future as it continues that ramp up.
Thanks, Bryan. So, Nimit, with the threat landscape being so broad and constantly changing, can companies avoid mobile application threat overload by focusing on specific threats? And if so, which one should they be concentrating on?
As Baljeet mentioned, you can never eliminate all the threats. You can make systems safe enough by doing a very objective analysis of the various risks, prioritizing them and looking at the probability of what that specific, attack surface might, bring to your specific application. But there are specific sort of standards and, metrics which are out there, which, still continue to be very applicable. For example, the Voatz has the mobile top 10, which is a broad category of, top 10 risk categories, risk areas where, all sensitive apps need to look at. So as we evolve into this new paradigm, I don't think much of that's gonna change. It's a lot based on cryptography, looking at how devices can prevent tampering, how applications can sense that, detect that early, and then take proper mitigations. And then how do you ensure, as close as you can, going to a zero trust ecosystem where you walk back from the worst case scenario where you assume everything's compromised and you still have to function in the presence of all those threats. So I think all that is still there and will continue to be there. And I don't think necessarily those categories are changing. They are just evolving. Some of them are getting more sophisticated, as we just spoke about 5G. I feel like looking at those criteria is always a good starting point. NIST has several publications on both sort of network security side as well as infrastructure security. So I think those are good guiding points for the entire ecosystem in general, and mobile is a part of that.
Good advice there. I like that. Baljeet, every mobile app out there is powered by APIs. What impact have APIs had on mobile and application security?
That's an interesting question we are exploring for a number of years. Let me take a step back and explain how API ecosystems are actually changing the threat landscape. You will be surprised to know that above 80% of the internet traffic is through APIs now. So in theory, 80% of the attack surface is also moved to APIs. As a matter of fact, Gartner has predicted that by 2022 or so, application security will be all about API security. Or they did not necessarily say in those words, but the majority attack surface would move to API security. And there is a reason why this is happening. if you look at the technology trends, software is moving into the cloud, data is moving into the cloud, and the traditional ways of software supply chain, the perceived threat of shipping your software is no more there. Of course, it is still there, but mobile applications will continue to be have a distributed architecture. They need to be connected to certain servers to talk to these intelligent systems over there. And as IoT takes off, as the number of applications take off, and Bryan talked about how 5G will actually accelerate that process. The rate at which the number of applications will be enabled that can leverage upon this massive infrastructure, we will see more and more applications, and mobile and social will add into that. So all these applications, processes, people will be connected through APIs. And as I mentioned, majority of the internet traffic will be through APIs. So securing APIs will become a prime focus for enterprises. Now, I do not want to go into too many technical details. APIs could be of many different flavors. I was speaking with Nimit just a few days ago. They have their own internal APIs. Not necessarily every company has publicly facing APIs, but we are moving towards a world where a lot of your devices, a lot of your applications, or people, your data processes will be all connected through APIs. And the fortunate or unfortunate part of that is these APIs will be many times will be assets that you did not build. You simply use them because you needed the connectivity, you needed that seamless integrations with different ecosystems that are out there. And the very nature of application security will evolve, because this is something, a small piece of code sitting somewhere in your millions of lines of code that is connecting those two systems. However, that connection is secured or not is something really difficult to validate. And another piece of research I would like to share is, with Voatz and the NIST and a lot of data that we analyzed with NVD, you'll be surprised to know that 80 to 90% of the applications are, authorization, authentication related problems. So to sum this up, these thoughts, API security will become very, very important aspect of application security. And I mean, there will be, a different level of, tools and processes and systems need to be evolved to manage those risks.
Do you think we're going to see more API type cyber attacks, as man in the middle attacks, data scraping, credential stuffing, things like that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And APIs are nothing but an input-output system. You give certain inputs, you get certain outputs back. And if these are publicly facing APIs, although these could be internal, but you have made it available to your customers and partners, and they're compromised, so they have a new way to inject, a script that can be executed in your UI or in your mobile app. So there are various ways, you are giving entry to the door or to your information systems. So the volume at which these attacks could happen will be very increasing. I want to actually add, if I can take one more minute, another thing which we are missing in this entire system is the human element. If you look at the progress of programming languages and the applications they are being built, more and more people are able to build applications because the ease with which these applications can be developed, especially when you have just APIs that you can connect to create applications, but the training and the cybersecurity aspect of this human element is not necessarily catching up with this human element. Security is not just a security of an architect. Your security is as, and if is not doing the due diligence to, to make sure all the other aspects of security, including the human elements, are not being taken care of, dimension from a threat perspective.
He's absolutely right. The API landscape is introducing a lot of, attack points, as you mentioned, a lot of other things. And this is where we have to think a little bit differently about our APIs and about our mobile apps, because what we're counting on is traditionally an API was used in an operating system, in an environment that you controlled and allowed you to do things. As we introduce into the mobile world and the 5G world and all of these different worlds, those APIs might be out in the wild a bit. So you're going to have to protect them in ways that you traditionally would not. You're going to have to think about, protection of the APIs before it actually leaves your application, because it's living on a device that may be living with 80 or 90 other applications or different things of the sort. It's definitely something that we have to, put some thoughts into about making sure that before it's even leaving your application that we're doing a level of security on those, because otherwise we're really introducing and changing the rules of the game and introducing attack points that in the past had never been thought about.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bryan. And obviously, cyber attacks aren't the only threat to app security. Another danger is misinformation. So what do you think people are getting wrong when they talk about app security, Bryan?
I think a lot of what people are getting wrong in app security is regarding kind of that things are secure from their application on. And this kind of goes along with exactly what we were just talking about with Baljeet. People have this idea that, okay, I send data from my application and it's instantly secure because of how things have been shown. And a lot of it has to do with the misunderstanding of how networking works, because people have this idea that TLS communications happen at the application level or immediately afterwards, and they actually don't. It happens further down in the operating system. The decisions are made and the sessions are starting to be established, but the reality is the data is moving in an insecure way, at least at the beginning. And we have to go away from the idea of that being okay, because when we look at the number of rogue applications, we look at the number of rogue actors that we're dealing with, we have to stop lying to ourselves about how security is being done and that what we're doing is good enough. If it was good enough, we wouldn't have the hacks that happen every day that, Sarah, I know you write about. You're writing about these things every day and writing about these concerns every day. We have to stop pretending that what we're doing is good enough and stop a defeatist attitude of, oh, everything's going to get hacked and that's how it goes. We have to start redirecting and making things as hard as we can. Granted, they are going to get in. If people weren't going to get in, then 64-bit encryption was good enough and all of us are in the wrong jobs, right? Because security isn't a concern, but that's unfortunately not the world. The world is that the hackers are getting in, the hackers are getting smarter all the time, they're finding new attack points, but we have to go away from the idea of not taking real self-improvement by not self-evaluating what we're doing well or what we're not doing well. We have to take a really, really hard look at things. As Baljeet said, APIs, Nimit talked about, the what's really important in your application. We have to go on that, and we have to go on the idea that we are going to secure things and really start changing the landscape of how security is done.
Nimit, is there anything you'd like to add to that in terms of what you think people are getting wrong when they talk about app security?
Yeah, I think to touch a little bit on what Bryan said, there's a lot of undercurrent of, almost like a defeatist attitude that the problem can never be solved. And, it's almost like people are given up or it's futile. And I'm kind of working from that perspective. I feel like it's it's one way to look at things, but there's another way to look at things where the whole notion of, zero trust and the ability to function in the presence of threats, I think there's always a positive side to it. And there's a way to make things safe enough. There's a way to implement sensing and monitoring to a level where you can get a very high level of assurance whether things are working okay or not. They might not be perfect, but nothing in our world is. I feel like a lot of the narrative and the reporting focuses on the negative, and we do hear about a lot of hacks and problems out there. We seldom hear about all the good things that are happening, as Bryan also touched on. I think there needs to be some self-reflection there, and there should be a focus on, trying to showcase and promote some of the, positive things that have happened. For every hack you hear about, there are 100 other cases where people are doing great stuff and have prevented hacks and breaches from happening. Why is it that we don't celebrate that and instead just focus on the negative? So I do feel like the narrative could use a little bit of positivity. I know you write about it a lot, so maybe that's a controversial subject, but I did want to bring that up.
Very subtle, Nimit, very subtle. Baljeet, for you, would you say that not considering the human element is the biggest thing that people are getting wrong when we talk about security?
Yeah, I think that is one factor which touches upon all the aspects that Bryan talked about, Nimit talked about, and all the good stuff even the high school students are doing as ethical hackers. They need to be promoted. Besides that point, I think security needs to be embedded very early on as part of the training programs. As I mentioned, the ease with which the applications can be created now. There are various technological platforms by which you can create the applications. It's not just one technology, one platform, or one language. The volume at which the data is increasing, and the amount of innovations that can be created using those data. Essentially, we are talking about all these applications that is consuming all these different aspects, right? However, if you pay attention to some of the, I don't want to highlight the academic part, but I was surprised even the graduate and undergraduate students were not as much aware as I would expect from a cybersecurity perspective when it came to writing a secure code. They have been taught. We have good programs around data science. We have good programs about engineering. A lot of schools are catching up. They are talking about security as a design, which is embedded as part of their training program. But I think we need to teach cybersecurity very early on, even at the school level. And I'm sharing based on that experience, because as I mentioned, security is not just a security expert's problem. Security is a collective responsibility, and it starts from good human practices and experience. And as I mentioned repeatedly, we will not be able to slow down this innovation wheel, right? And even kids will continue to build applications, but if they're not building secured applications somewhere, somehow, but simply because they didn't have a proper training, from the cybersecurity perspective, there will be problems. So looks like I'm having some internet issues. I'm not sure if you lost some of my audio or not, but I'm happy to repeat myself if there's a need. But I hope I answered your question, Sarah.
I think we caught most of that it's about educating people early about cybersecurity was the main thrust. So yeah, thank you very much. I'll circle back if anyone's got extra questions, if they put them in the chat. If you missed something that Baljeet said, put the questions in the chat and we'll ask him at the end to do a quick recap. But moving on now to how mobile application developers respond when they do become the victim of a cyber attack. Nimit, what are the current response strategies that mobile app developers are implementing, and do you think that they can be improved?
Yeah, I think there's always scope for improving. I think one of the key things is to have a overall security policy and what we call as a issue disclosure policy. So I think that needs to be front and center. So when you have a incident or a report of any kind, you're not scrambling to prepare a response. Like you have a playbook, you have a criteria. If somebody is reporting a vulnerability, you have a plan to address it or mitigate it and kind of respond in a in a time frame which is, if somebody's doing research around it, they can do what's called as a coordinated disclosure. You inform your clients, and so there is a best practice playbook. It's been around for a bit. I think a lot of people are now adopting it. So that's sort of a good sign industry wide, in various sub aspects as well. The other thing is to have what strongly recommend as a continuous monitoring, because there were days in the past, or times in the past, where we would pen test stuff, or test a mobile application on a certain cadence, let's say twice a month or once a week. I think all that has changed dramatically. Now everything is pretty much 24/7. If you are especially if you're working in an area what's classified as a critical infrastructure, you can no longer wait till the next week to do another round of pen testing. It's almost every day, every hour, you're on your toes. And if you don't have a plan to react to an adverse scenario, then you'll be caught flat-footed, and your response is not going to be optimal. So I think having a plan, having a disclosure management policy, and overall security policy, I think those are some key best practices which everybody is starting to adopt, or I should say most people are starting to adopt. So that's definitely a good trend. Recently, there was a notification from the US federal government directing pretty much every department in the government to have a CVD, which is a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program, which is another great sign, because to do that program, you'll have to make sure you have the proper process and you are able to react to adverse situations quickly, and have proper coordination across all the stakeholders.
Thank you. And you mentioned attacks on critical infrastructure there, and we've seen a few of those this year, quite scarily. Bryan, I was going to ask you the question that we had at the top of this webinar today. Do you think our fear of attacks and our response to them is equal to the threats that exist? Just a tiny question there for you.
That's right, just a small one. I think we're moving in the right direction. I think we're starting to get serious about it. But in corporate America, what we're finding is a lot of times the discussions about security are not necessarily happening aggressively enough at the board levels and at the executive levels about how threats are happening or how things are going. And I think that is something that really needs to continue and change, because a lot of times, a lot of the discussions are we good enough? Are we good enough for now? But the problem is that, are we good enough for now is what's leading to hacks. We have to be more aggressive about it, because the hackers are not sitting back and saying, oh, what they've done is good enough, let me go find something else. They're finding new ways to do it. The number of zero-day attacks that we find are increasing over and over and over again throughout the industry. We have to get on the idea that we have to start doing more, and we have to start taking, as Baljeet said, a training mindset for our young engineers coming out. Nimit talked about people going out and doing more about it and thinking about security to start with. Those are really the type of things that we have to start doing, and we have to start doing it not just from a perspective as a developer, but as a corporation. It's really a fiduciary responsibility for every executive and every board member to be treating the data and treating it in a way that makes a difference. There was recently a hack of one of the cell phone vendors that I don't want to mention. It was sent out as an email to let people know their data was compromised. When did it become acceptable to send an email that your data was stolen? Where was the reaction to that? And that shows that we have to do more than that. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard, and we have to go on the idea that we're not going to accept that someone going out and having a security attack on us is just, oh, it's okay, don't worry, you lost some data, hire a monitoring service for your credit and you'll be okay. we have to get more aggressive on it, and we have to continue and be diligent in our efforts.
Absolutely. Well, in the spirit of helping to educate the next generation of up-and-comers, I thought I'd ask the panelists all to share a little bit of their expert insight now. So starting with Baljeet, if your connection's clear, what advice would you give a mobile app developer who is seeking to create a secure environment for their systems?
One thought I would definitely share is know your supply chain. Even though your software footprint of your mobile app could be small, but the impact could be very large because your app could be very innovative, connected to different digital systems. So know your supply chain. When I say supply chain, I'm not just talking about different ingredients of your application. That's what is being demanded in the presidential order, to disclose your software supply chain. Nimit said something important. I want to tie this to this thought I'm explaining. Not only you need responsible disclosure policy, you also need an open disclosure policy for your supply chain. And a lot of companies were hesitant in doing that because if somebody discloses they have this particular open source library or that particular ingredient as part of the application, if that library is compromised, what's the impact on your application? Now you have to see in this context that not every vulnerability that is disclosed compromises your application, because there are a lot of context around it. So if you think backwards, disclosing that actually perhaps makes you more stronger, and open source has actually proven that many eyes watching the ecosystem is much better than just living in the dark. And the sad part is a lot of vulnerabilities that got exploited, it's not that they were disclosed today. They were sitting in those applications for months and months. And somebody exploited those vulnerabilities simply because they got lazy. So having not only a responsible disclosure policy, but also a responsible disclosure policy from your ingredient supply chain perspective is very important for mobile application development.
Thank you. Nimit, do you have something you want to add to that? What advice would you give app developers?
Yeah, I think I would kind of echo what Baljeet had mentioned when he first spoke, is incorporating security as part of your overall app design process, not as an afterthought. Because if you're thinking of security as an afterthought, it's already too late. So you have to start with the security baseline as you're designing your various aspects of your system, looking at the software supply chain, looking at the accessibility features. I think security has to be the initial baseline ingredient. And so coming at it from a design methodology is really, really important, because duct taping security later on is actually really hard, makes things worse. You end up spending a lot more resources, and sometimes you have to throw away everything and start from scratch. So might as well do it the right way in the beginning. The other thing I think, which is a key point of friction of our times, is whenever you're building something, there's so much data about us already out there, and some of it is basically not in our control anymore, unfortunately. But we still have a chance to respect user privacy and give users at least some semblance of hope that not everything's lost, that people care about the sensitivity of other people's data. And so incorporating that mindset, that only use what you need, don't share what you don't have the rights to share with third party, make everything opt-in, where you seek somebody's permission before doing anything rather than after the fact. I think those are some fundamental privacy focused mindsets, which a lot of people didn't think about, 10, 20 years ago. But as our society's evolved, as everything's online now, I would urge everybody to, along with security, keep privacy top of mind and put yourself in the shoes of a consumer for whatever you're building, and see how you would react in that scenario. And I think that's a very eye-opening kind of feeling. So I would encourage everybody to try that.
Very good tips. Bryan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, I'd like to echo what my two colleagues had mentioned about security being something that the developers need to keep in mind. But I think one of the things that I also love to always give advice to young developers or new developers is sometimes the biggest thing isn't the problem, it's your reaction to the problem. And you have to make sure that when you do have an issue or you do have something that happens, what you want to do is you want to go out and say, okay, when this happened, what actually was the cause of it? What was the root issue? What was it that we need to improve? Because sometimes the problem that you see in front of you wasn't actually the cause of what happened. And I think sometimes the cause and effect and the post review of any kind of hack or any type of event or anything of that sort, or as you're building an application, the post review of your application code and what you're doing, I think is as important as everything or as anything that you do. But I think the key to it is don't do a post review and do it in a way where you're afraid of finding out that the emperor has no clothes or there was something done wrong. Do a post review in a very honest and open way to say, what did we not do well? What did we do well? And what can we do better? And I think that's the important thing. Have a culture and work with teammates that allow you to do those things and to really become better at what you do by being honest with yourself about what you're not doing well. And I think that's the most important thing for new developers to do, because a lot of times when we're seeing these security holes, Baljeet had mentioned it earlier, it's poorly implemented code. Why do they have poorly implemented code? Because they never challenge themselves and ask themselves, did I do this the right way? Or went and did a post review on it the right way.
More excellent advice there. Thank you very much. Well, we're going to finish today on a question from one of our viewers. This is from David, and he's messaged in to say, how can we protect against the other applications the user installed on the mobile device that might have vulnerabilities? Who'd like to tackle that one?
I can take a crack at that. I think it's a very important thing to keep in mind, where because of the shared ecosystem, which a lot of it run on APIs, as Baljeet mentioned earlier, you may have done everything right in your specific application, but you're sharing something, or there's a different application on the same device, which could have an adverse impact on what you're trying to do. And basically, as we know, sometimes it's the weakest link that compromises, a lot more other stuff that's built around it. So that's one of the key challenges. There are few approaches to do that. One is you can use app specific containers, where you kind of create a virtualized environment around your specific application, so nobody else can come in but people you've sort of authorized at the operating system level. And then the other approach is go deep towards the zero trust model, where you assume from the very beginning that the environment where you're going to be installing your application is going to be unsafe. You're going to have not one, but perhaps tens of different applications which are making the whole ecosystem unsafe. And then you have to make a decision. Can you do something which will let you function and do the work you want to do in the presence of these threats? And if your answer is yes, then you work from that baseline. If you've determined that you can't do that by yourself, then you look for other applications, other partnerships where potentially they can plug in the hole, they can help you, secure the transport, they can help you build another layer of encryption or tamper detection, or third-party app disablement. And so I think if you go with that kind of step-by-step approach, you can find a solution which might work for your specific use case.
And if I could add to that, I think the key is that if you're going to live in a world where there's other applications and other things living, you have to go on the idea that the security of your data is your job. It's not the job of the operating system of the device. It's not the job of, some connector running somewhere else. It's your job. So you have to start worrying about that, doing things at the application layer and making sure that as you're sending stuff out, because if you're securing it before it goes to the API, well, then at that point, someone interacting or intercepting is going to be a lot less of an issue. But at the end of the day, you have to go on the idea that security is your problem and it's not the problem of everyone else out there. And that really, I think, goes along with what Nimit and Baljeet and I have talked a lot about. Security becomes the main focus for yourself, and that's where you have to start thinking about doing things at a level beforehand, because unfortunately, when you installed an app normally, that app didn't have all of this other world going on. The apps on your computer tended to be safe. The apps in your environment and your corporate network tended to be safe. Well, now you're running on a mobile application where your customer or someone could download anything. And, there could be, a million different games, apps, video, whatever, that are functioning on that device or on that IoT device. You have to go on the idea that you need to take the ownership of security because you're the only one who can.
Yeah, if I can
Thanks,
add to
Bryan.
that very quickly, remove the apps that you don't need on your mobile. So
Absolutely.
we always forget to do that because kids take your phone and they install certain apps and you forget. So they could be sleeping agents. So as Bryan said, security is a collective responsibility, and you're part of that. And your part is at least check what you need, what you don't need. Don't do it if you don't need it.
Absolutely, all great points. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a really interesting conversation today. We've covered that security starts with design, that data handling is a major factor. And although we can't completely remove risk, we can minimize it. We just have to balance that sort of zero trust approach against a defeatist attitude. We talked a little bit about 5G coming in the future and how that's going to change the threat landscape, but it's going to maybe sort of bring out different flavors of the threats we already have, but there's going to be a lot to consider with that coming up. We talked about protecting APIs before they leave your application. Taking responsibility for your security is a major theme here. I liked that. And training people early about cybersecurity, especially app developers. And I think kids generally, everyone, just getting in there early and letting people know what they should be looking out for is great. And then in terms of responding to cyber threats, we talked about having a plan in place and making sure that you do continuous monitoring and that the are we good enough now attitude isn't good enough. So all fantastic points. So yeah, I want to wrap up things today by saying I'm going to go and carve a Halloween pumpkin now with just the words data breach, and wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Bye.